So when we think about ships, we think about them sailing, right? Like, that's what ships are supposed to do. So when we think about them historically, the image that comes to mind tends to be one of these big wooden vessels with courses of sails plying their way across the high seas. But what if we reframe these ships as plants, like a forest or maybe a garden? Because when we're discussing these big wooden ships, we're talking about technology and warfare and the economy of trade, but we're also talking about the wood of the hull, the cotton of the sails, and the hemp of the lines, all of which come from terrestrial landscapes. And when these factors, wood, cotton, hemp, combine under the auspices of European colonialism, we can talk about shipmaking and shipbreaking as industries that have tractable impacts on the colonial landscape in ways that are still meaningful today. This is particularly true when discussing the wood. My case study comes from the port of Alexandria, Virginia, just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. There, in the 18th century, 3 ships were cut down to just their bottoms and intentionally submerged. Those submerged ships were built upon as foundations for the late 18th century wharves. And while this is in Alexandria, this is a practice that happened all over North America at this point in time, in ports like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston. It was actually so common and so vernacular a practice that it merited very little documentation in its time, which means that we have very few textual ideas of how or why people in the past engaged in this type of labor. And make no mistake, it was every bit as laborious as milling new timber. You can't cut a ship in half with a handsaw, after all. It takes a considerable amount of effort. To answer this why question, we need to go back to the 17th century and take a look at the colonial landscape the way it existed when Europeans first began the processes of colonization. The low-lying areas next to the Potomac, like the hills around them, would have been covered in trees like chestnut, hickory, elm, and particularly oak and pine. Pre-contact indigenous forest management involved, in part, the clearing out of underbrush to encourage the growth of tall, strong trees, the likes of which Europeans love to write home about, including this Jesuit missionary saying, "All is high wood except for where the Indians have cleared for corn," when discussing Maryland. Now, these woods presented both a challenge and an opportunity for Euro-American colonists. The challenge? Cash crop agriculture for goods like tobacco required wide swaths of open, cultivable land, of which very little was naturally occurring in 17th century North America. The opportunity? Europeans, and England in particular, had cleared out much of its arboreal resources by the 17th century because timber was their primary building material, as well as a primary fuel source before the advent of coal-powered steam. Clearing away all these tall, strong trees meant that timber could be traded between England and its colonies, and in the process, land could be opened up for agriculture. By the 18th century, timber trade expanded coastwise between colonies, including those in Canada and the Caribbean, and the North American timber trade became truly international. Oak and pine were critical in this trade. Because North American white oak and Eastern white pine were mechanically similar to the European English oak and Scots pine, they could be used the same ways without Europeans having to adjust their base of knowledge. You could burn, cut, and shape the new timbers the same way that you could their European counterparts. These also happen to be critical for shipbuilding, with oak being valued for its durability and water tightness in making ship frames, while pine is valued for its long, straight trunks in making planks for ships. And it cannot be overstated how important watercraft, whether they were large naval vessels or small canoes, were prior to the advent of the railroad. There's no way of knowing securely exactly how many watercraft existed in the 18th century British Atlantic, but between 1772 and 1782, over 130,000 pounds sterling of just oak were imported into just the royal dockyards of England from Virginia and Maryland. This quantity of timber represents the greatest quantity outside of New England of timber imported into the royal dockyards from any British colonial territory at this point in time. So when it came time for the citizens of Alexandria to establish their city in 1749, the landscape had been fundamentally altered. Gone were the oak and pine forests of the past, replaced with hundreds upon hundreds of acres of agricultural fields and an urban port to connect them to the wider economy. A 1999 tree survey by a couple of environmental scientists named Abrahams and Copenhaver actually suggests that by the time of the American Revolution, all of Virginia's old growth timber was depleted, and that which was there was being regrown as part of the settler colonial economy. And when we look at historical pollen, which preserves in layers in the soil of the region, we see the same thing. All instances of trees decline after European settlements. Now, this example is taken from Delaware, but it occurs again and again, with oak declining first, starting in the 18th century, and pine, which is quicker growing, dipping a little bit, but actually spiking as oak clears before it too is fully depleted. Now, regional pollen signatures like this track wind-pollinated plants, so crops, which are usually self-pollinated or insect-pollinated, don't show up as strongly, but wind-pollinated weeds in crop fields, like weedy grasses and ragweed, spike as trees go down, suggesting that there is a direct relationship between the clearing out of forest resources and the development of agriculture. So when it came time for the citizens of Alexandria to expand their wharves in the 1780s, they didn't have any sources of watertight oak nearby. Some had to be floated down from further upstream, some was imported from timber-rich New England, and some was reused, taken from vessels in the local shipyard that were no longer fit to sail, but that had plenty of durable oak left in them. And while I find this fascinating in its own right, it has contemporary implications. Today, the waterfront in Alexandria looks like this. Where once deep roots of old growth trees held fast the riverbanks, today, much of the area along the waterfront is reclaimed and in danger of erosion. Coastal erosion rates in the Chesapeake range from less than 6 inches to over 30 feet per year. And riverine communities like Alexandria are at increased risk of flooding due to this erosion. Looking at how these water lines have changed over time lets us think about roadmaps for things like shore stabilization and flood mitigation in the future. The roots of these problems are further in the past than I think we sometimes consider, but I would contend that the roots of the solutions are there as well. Thank you.